Welcome everyone to our next section. I'm today's host, Julia Liu, and I have been organized open source conference since 2029, and with COSCUP since 2020, have been 5 years as a conference organizers for open source. And in the last 2 years, I've been doing open source design workshop for Internet Shutdown. So if anybody is interested, please talk to me about this topic. Enough about me. I'm about to introduce next speaker, Samuel Giddens. Samuel is a security engineer in residence at Ruby Central. He has been working Ruby's tools for the past decades, and he will walk us through the shift in Ruby Centrals from event-based programs to a secure founding for infrastructures, including hiring a full-time employee. Today's topic, founding Ruby infrastructure as a nonprofit. Let's welcome Samuel Giddens. Okay.
So I can see that talking about money in open source is not a very popular topic today. So I need you all to laugh at every joke very loudly for the recording. Can you do that for me? Yes. Woo! So good morning. I am Samuel Giddens, and today I'm going to be talking about something that affects every Ruby developer, whether or not you realize it, which is how we fund the infrastructure that we all depend on every day. When you run gem install or bundle install, you're relying on a massive set of infrastructure that somehow has to be paid for and maintained. But here's the thing, you don't really want to think about that. It just works, right? Well, that's both the beauty and the problem of open source. It works so well, we take it for granted. But I don't want us to take this stuff for granted. I want us to think about, just for a little bit, how we can make sure that Ruby infrastructure remains sustainable for the next 20 years. So first, a bit about me. I'm Samuel Giddens. You can find me online pretty much everywhere as SE Giddens. I've been working on Ruby packaging for almost a dozen years now, writing bugs for at least that long. For the past couple of years, I've been the security engineer in residence at Ruby Central, focused on securing the Ruby packaging ecosystem. So just a quick disclaimer, I have opinions, they are my own, they don't reflect those of my employer, et cetera, et cetera. So a little bit about that employer, Ruby Central, since that's kind of central to today's story. See what I did there? So Ruby Central is a 501c3 nonprofit that was founded back in 2001. For most of their history, you probably knew them as the organization that puts on RubyConf, a conference they've been running for well over 20 years now, and up until a month ago, I could say that they ran RailsConf. Unfortunately, if you never got to make it to a RailsConf, it's too late now. But what you might not know is that Ruby Central has also been taking up the mantle as the steward of Ruby's most critical infrastructure. They maintain rubygems.org, which is Ruby's package registry. And so every time you run gem install or bundle install, you're hitting their servers. Their mission is to sustain and grow the Ruby ecosystem so that, in a couple of years we can do these talks in even bigger and bigger auditoriums. So again, the mission has evolved over these past 20 years from being focused around organizing conferences to sustaining and growing the whole ecosystem. And that's really what I want to talk about today. How that happened, why it matters, and what Ruby Central has learned about making open source infrastructure sustainable. So before we dive into sort of the economics of all this, let's establish something important. Virtually all of the Ruby stuff that we use is open source. RubyGems.org, all of the site that serves all of the gems is open source. The package manager is open source. Ruby itself is open source. Our web frameworks are open source. Our application servers are open source. Our testing frameworks are open source. It's all open source. But that sort of creates a unique challenge. So before we dive into Ruby specifically, I do want to take a step back and talk about the economics of open source more broadly. Because I think to understand how to fund Ruby infrastructure, we first need to understand why funding open source is such a unique challenge. So let me paint you a picture of how the economics work, or more realistically, how the economics don't work in open source. So we sort of have two main groups of people in any open source ecosystem. On one side, we have maintainers. They're the people who write the code and review pull requests, set project direction, handle security issues, keep the lights on, and get to do the most fun thing of any open source maintainer's career: click the release button. That's always fun. On the other side, we have consumers, and that's probably some of you. Consumers use Ruby gems, sometimes file bug reports, and really the key thing is consumers benefit from using open source. Now, in a traditional business, the relationship between these groups is pretty simple. A consumer pays maintainers for their work. But in open source, we've deliberately broken that connection. There is no marketplace where I say, hey, can I give you $10 to use your open source library? The point of open source is the opposite, that you can go and download a package, download a library, use it, and not even have to tell me about it. But that creates a really interesting dynamic. So, talking a bit about the money, every software project has costs. And let me break down what those costs look like. They really fall into two main categories. So first, there's development. This is the human, or I guess it's 2025, and after Matt's talk, I should maybe update this. This is the human or AI time, which might actually be more expensive than human time, required to actually maintain and improve the software. Someone needs to review those pull requests, fix security vulnerabilities, plan new features, make architectural decisions. And this is skilled engineering work. This is what our jobs are. And it takes a lot of time. It's hard, right? We can pat ourselves on the back and say our job is hard. And on the other side, there's operations. This is the actual cost of running the infrastructure. For something like RubyGems.org, we're talking about servers, databases, the cost of a worldwide global CDN, monitoring tools, backup systems. And when you're serving 40 billion gem downloads per year, those costs add up pretty quickly. Now, in a for-profit company, both of those costs are pretty straightforward to handle. The math is simple. Revenue comes in from customers, and that revenue gets spent on paying developers and paying for infrastructure. It's a closed loop. Companies hire developers to work on their products. They pay the cloud provider bills. They have a clear understanding of their costs and their revenue. And they can make business decisions to make sure that the revenue number is bigger than the cost number. I happen to have a degree in economics, but you don't need an economics degree to know that Making money, good. How do you make money? Well, you make more than you spend. Open source breaks this model because we don't have customers paying companies. So here's the RubyGems example. We serve a bunch of downloads every year. That's a pretty big scale. We're talking about infrastructure that looks like a lot of companies' infrastructure. But RubyGems has, let me add up all the numbers, zero revenue. We get paid $0 for providing a service. But we still have really expensive operations, the same cost that a commercial service would have: servers, bandwidth, databases, monitoring, et cetera, and the engineers to do all that stuff. Those are really complex development needs. Those are things that require expensive skills to get done. So how does this work? Well, there are really only a few ways that engineering time gets paid for in open source. So the first way is that companies pay. This is actually pretty common. Companies pay employees to work on specific open source libraries as part of their job. Lots of companies have realized that contributing to the projects that they rely on is a good business investment. Think, for example, of the fact that Shopify employs a bunch of people who are on Ruby and Rails core. So Shopify pays for development indirectly of Ruby and Rails. They think that's a pretty smart business decision, and I would tend to agree. The second way is that somehow magically funding appears to pay maintainers directly. This might be through things like corporate sponsorships or grants, donations, or other creative funding mechanisms. Can I have a show of hands? How many people have magically had money appear to help them to help pay for your work on open source? So that's like 2 hands. It's not pretty common. It's pretty cool when it happens, but it's not something you can rely on. And the third way, which is unfortunately still the most common, is that no one gets paid. And us as open source maintainers essentially donate our time. We work nights and weekends maintaining critical infrastructure that millions of people depend on and get paid nothing for it. In fact, sometimes we often pay out of pocket because we like our open source projects. Now, it just so happens that for infrastructure costs, there's sometimes a fourth option, which is infrastructure can be donated. And sometimes this makes operational costs an easier problem to solve than development costs. Cloud providers like AWS, Google Cloud, and Azure often provide credits to open source projects. CDN companies like Fastly and Cloudflare donate their services. Hosting companies might provide free servers. And all this is great. We've benefited enormously from this kind of infrastructure donation. But here's the thing. Even if someone hands you a bunch of cloud credits, someone still needs to do the work to spend those credits. I can't spend AWS credits at the grocery store, at least not yet. Someone needs to configure servers, monitor performance, respond to outages, plan for capacity, deal with security updates, all that stuff. And that someone is usually a volunteer maintainer who's already overwhelmed. And this brings us to sort of the fundamental problem. And, ooh, that's really tiny, I'm sorry. This is one of my favorite XKCD comics of all time, and it perfectly captures what we're talking about. All of modern digital infrastructure, all of our apps, the websites we visit, the cloud services we use, Some of it all somehow depends on a project some random person in Nebraska has been thanklessly maintaining since 2001. And this isn't just a joke. I mean, it is a funny comic, but it is an accurate description of how much of our digital infrastructure actually works. Critical projects that millions or billions of people depend on are maintained by volunteers who get little to no recognition and oftentimes no compensation. And that's exactly the status quo that we've been trying to improve upon with the state of Ruby infrastructure. This is a classic problem in economics called the tragedy of the commons. Everyone benefits from Ruby infrastructure. Every Ruby developer in this room, I'm betting, I could be wrong, has downloaded gems. Pretty much every company using Ruby depends on rubygems.org to be fast, secure, and reliable. But very few people, relative to the number of users of open source, contribute back, either with time or money. And it's not because people are being selfish on purpose. It's because the incentive structure doesn't align. Why would you pay for something that you can get for free? Why would you spend your weekend fixing someone else's infrastructure when you have your own projects to work on? This is the tragedy of the commons in open source. The resource, in this case, Ruby infrastructure, gets used by everyone, but maintained by very few people. So let's take a step back, and I'll tell you a bit how this played out historically in the Ruby ecosystem. And ultimately, this is a story of how this model wasn't sustainable. And some of this story might be familiar if you've been around in the Ruby world for a while. So for most of RubyGems history, infrastructure maintenance was entirely volunteer-driven. People like me, contributed because I cared. Did it in my spare time and with no expectation of compensation. I got into contributing to Bundler and RubyGems because I thought they were cool projects and I thought working on them was fun. It wasn't wrong, but that meant everything was best effort. If servers went down, well, hopefully someone would notice and fix it eventually. If there was a security issue, hopefully someone with access would be available to handle it and not, say, camping in the wilderness. And for a while, this worked okay. When the software engineering world was smaller, the stakes were lower, the security threats were less sophisticated, this volunteer model could keep things running. My favorite part of this model is the frustration-driven development bit, where you decide to implement something because you're just mad it doesn't exist. This is how like half of Bundler came to be. But it wasn't sustainable long term, and we started to see the cracks. We hit a breaking point. It was a long time coming, and it was a long time of this same situation. Having 0 full-time maintainers, of needing infinite time to accomplish all of our ambitious plans, and of having $0 of actual money coming in and hitting someone's bank account. And the reality is that causes burnout. There's always work to do, always performance improvements to make, security issues to address, features to implement, operational problems to solve. No revenue stream, no business model, and ultimately what that led to is no way to pay people for their time. And the result was predictable. People got burned out. You contribute intensively for a while, you care a ton about these projects, you feel so much ownership over them, and the situation doesn't improve, there's just more work to do. You get exhausted, you step back, you find other things to do. But when that happens, the burden just shifts to other volunteers, and the cycle repeats. But there was another factor that made this crisis more urgent. And that's the infrastructure that we're talking about is more than just code. It's more than just libraries. It's more than just something you can Git clone. There's a big operational burden to run something like rubygems.org. In the early days when the site was smaller and less critical, occasional downtime wasn't the end of the world. If the site went down, people would notice eventually and someone would fix it. But now we're handling a bunch of requests every second, 24/7. I would say there are no breaks, but I've looked at the graph and people are pretty good about, that week between Christmas and New Year's not working, so that's pretty nice. But other than that, no breaks. If rubygems.org goes down, it impacts developers worldwide. This isn't just about writing code anymore. It requires true responsibility. Writing code is kind of easy to fit into your life. You open up your laptop, clone a project, push up changes when you're done, get review eventually, maybe the thing gets merged. It's really flexible. And it's fun. Like, as Mats was talking about, we like writing code. We do it oftentimes because it's fun. It's creative work that we enjoy. Operations and being on call for something isn't like that. Being responsible for infrastructure means being available when things break. If that's at 3 a.m. when you're asleep, if it's over the holidays, if you're on vacation, it means having your phone on, ready to drop everything and respond to outages. It's stressful, it's disruptive, and it requires an entirely different level of commitment. It isn't just a weekend coding thing. And it turns out that there are far fewer people who are willing to, carry their laptops 24/7 than are willing to sit down on a Friday night with a beer in hand and crank out some code. And the thing is, the scale and criticality of Ruby infrastructure has grown to the point where it genuinely requires professional operational support. And that's just not something you can expect volunteers to provide sustainably. Today, the consequences of infrastructure failure are much more serious than they were when rubygems.org started in 2009. People are now talking about this buzzword supply chain security as like a critical business concern. There are regulatory requirements coming in around the world that make concern about the software we ship a legal concern. And with that increased focus, there's more active and sophisticated exploitation of open source that has been happening. And it makes big news now. And those concerns turn into asks of open source project. So for some concrete numbers about rubygems.org, in May of this year, people downloaded gems. Does anyone want to guess how many gems were downloaded in May? What was that? 1 billion? You're close. It was 4 billion gems were downloaded in 1 month. In 1 month. And if you add that up, that is over a petabyte of bandwidth used. And that works out to 431, not megabits, megabytes per second of traffic. Doing the division again, that is 1,500 gems being downloaded every second. And those numbers keep growing every month. When you multiply that number by 12, you get 50 billion downloads per year. And that's conservative because we're still seeing growth. There are more people using Ruby than ever. That number is increasing, and there are more people using open source Ruby libraries. This isn't a hobby project anymore. This is critical internet infrastructure that requires quote unquote enterprise grade stuff. You can't have the service go down because a volunteer is unavailable. When there's a security vulnerability that impacts a gem that millions of applications depend on, you need a security expert available to respond immediately. In short, operating this stuff in 2025 demands a lot more of maintainers than was asked in 2005. So I just want you to think a bit, what would happen if rubygems.org went down? Well, immediately you'd see gem install commands would start to fail. Bundle install commands would start to fail. CI stops working. Deployment of Ruby applications starts getting blocked. And that's just the immediate impact. As hours pass, the effects would compound. You'd have development teams around the world unable to make progress on their work. You'd have production deployments be blocked. All of us would be unable to do our hobby open source coding. And Ruby's reputation as a production-grade ecosystem would be damaged. And this isn't a hypothetical. We've seen this happen with, we've seen similar scenarios in other ecosystems. And the consequences are real and immediate and sometimes make the front page of the newspaper. So there's a story here about how Ruby Central has evolved over time from primarily being a conference organization to being the steward of this infrastructure. And I want to quickly, because I know I've been talking slowly, walk through this because I think this evolution offers a model that other open source communities can learn from. So it started as in the US, the tax code is super complicated, and there's a particular type of nonprofit called a 501c3. The organization was originally formed to put on RubyConf and RailsConf. And now it maintains rubygems.org infrastructure. It's an organization that's a natural place to match funding sources with people who are doing the work that needs to be funded. It's a neutral steward with aligned incentives. Ruby Central is an organization that represents the Ruby community. It isn't just about one particular company. It's also not a competitor to any one particular company. And this nonprofit structure is really key here. The only motivation Ruby Central has is to make Ruby better for everyone and to grow the Ruby community and make more people into happy Rubyists. There's no shareholders who want profits. There's no commercial agenda. The job is match dollars to workers. Companies and individuals give them money, and they use that money to pay talented engineers to work on this infrastructure. This didn't happen overnight, though. So it took a while after the founding for Ruby Central to have anything to do with any engineering infrastructure. Then it took another decade for Ruby Central to go to regularly paying for open source development. And then in 2023, just 2 short years ago, Ruby Central hired their first-time infrastructure employee. And that's me. My job is entirely focused on maintaining and improving Ruby Gems, rubygems.org, and the broader Ruby packaging ecosystem. Once Ruby Central committed to being infrastructure stewards, they had to structure themselves for long-term sustainability. That means having things like real governance and a CFO who knows how to balance the books. It means publishing financials every year, which is a legal requirement to be a not-for-profit in the US. Having multiple revenue streams, so not just one person who is throwing money at an open source project. There's community input in major decisions. So, looking to last year, here's a breakdown of where the money came from. 15% roughly from donated services, 62% being program-specific money, 8% from a membership program, and 15% from corporate sponsorships. And as you can see, there's some diversity here. There's room to improve that split. But Ruby Central doesn't only have one source of funding. They've got a bunch of different funding programs. So people donating infrastructure, people making grants. So for example, the Alpha Omega grant covers my residency. That's what's paying for me to be here and talk with all of you today. There's corporate sponsorship. In particular, I want to call out Shopify's Ruby Shield program. They committed $1 million over 4 years for Ruby ecosystem security. Ruby Central has an open source supporter program. And there's individual memberships. And of course, like any good not-for-profit, they'll just take your money. And it works because of a fundamental truth. Open source continues to grow. It's always going to require resources. And the biggest projects require a steward, because someone needs to be responsible for the commons. Nonprofits help formalize the idea of the community as a real legal entity. As I said, they're not a competitor. They're not a government that makes mandates. And they have aligned incentives because the community here is us. It's those of us in this room. So the current landscape is better. There's now one full-time person working on Ruby packaging, and that's me. Yeah, woo, it's my job, it's a job. It's pretty cool. I have a job to work on open source. My job is securing the Ruby supply chain, and I'm gonna say I do a pretty good job at that. No corrections welcome. We have 24/7 on-call for rubygems.org, and we serve a bunch of gems. And that goes without much, if any, downtime. There's some other role models in this space. There's the PSF, which runs PyPI. They have multiple full-time staff. I'm pretty jealous. And they also work on conference revenue and memberships and donations. There's also the Rust Foundation, which has a bunch of corporate members. They've really focused on their governance structure, and they also have a bunch of different funding sources. But we're also facing new challenges. The growing scale means more resources are required. The more people who use Ruby Gems, the more work it is to serve all the gems. Security threats are increasingly sophisticated. We've seen nation-state actors spend years cultivating resources to take over single open source projects. Compliance requirements add operational complexity both for the operators of rubygems.org and also for people who are using open source software. And the expectations for reliability are higher. But there's also opportunities that make me optimistic. Companies are increasingly aware of supply chain risks, and they're willing to spend money to address those risks. Governments are funding work in this space. There's foundation support for open source sustainability. And there's much more community willingness to contribute financially to open source. So, the future. We've seen that there are proven models that work. Companies understand what open source is and the value that they get from open source much more now than they did a decade ago. There are more options for getting money to work on open source. The community is more involved with open source. Open source is more popular. More people know about open source. More people view open source as just like a normal part of being a software engineer. And that's super cool. And that has meant that open source as a whole is stronger than ever. So I have to, of course, put this in. I wouldn't be a good employee if I didn't. So how can people help with this situation? Well, individuals can make donations, have memberships to the nonprofit. You can advocate at work for work to send some money. Of course, you can always still contribute code. PRs are always welcome. Companies can sponsor. Companies can provide infrastructure. Companies can allow their employees to contribute to the open source projects that they rely on. Because in the end, we want a really strong Ruby ecosystem. We want infrastructure that just works. We want a security team that's making sure that Ruby gems are secure for everyone, not just the biggest companies. We want professionals to maintain the libraries that we rely on. We want new features. We want things like emojis when we run commands in our terminal. Emojis are expensive. And we want sustainable funding so that these projects, this infrastructure, this ecosystem can last for decades to come. So I know I went over time. Not sorry. If you have any questions either about Ruby Central or sustainable open source funding, open source security, you can find me at SE Giddens everywhere on the internet. My email is there. If you would like to throw my employer some money, there's a website where they will happily take it. So please come find me afterwards and let's chat. Thank you.
Do we have question here for the speakers? Anyone? Or, yeah, please.
May I know how much it costs per year to support infrastructure?
So I don't think I had the numbers in my slides, so I'm not going to give a number. I know that on the donated infrastructure side, if we talk about the rates that could be negotiated for that, so not like sticker price, we're talking somewhere between $250,000 and $500,000 US per year, just for the infrastructure. Of course, just like any software business, except not a business, the most expensive thing is people. So that is a bigger number. I don't want to say any numbers that are wrong, but it's It's essentially a small company's worth of costs.
Hi, I have a question. For Ruby Gems to deliver so much gem to all the companies globally, how does site reliability engineering works in Ruby Gems?
So the question is, how does site reliability engineering work? Let me see if I can answer this without any words. This is the site reliability engineering. It's the same as you'd probably find at work, but at a smaller scale. We're lucky to have CDN resources donated by Fastly. So, you know, if the site does go down, as long as Fastly's still up, like gems will or should still be served. We've got a bunch of monitoring services donated by Datadog. We have a 24/7 on-call rotation, which is split across 4 people. I am one of them. I am on call 365 days a year, 6 hours a day. We still are sort of doing a lot of crossing our fingers and putting in work to make it so there is less site reliability engineering that's needed to keep the site reliable. Well, thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Samuel.